listeners, one and all. We welcome you to this, our pantomime, of one Johannes Kepler in his time. This sage, in whom all nature's forms did see, the evidence of God's geometry. In snowflakes and in planets and our sight, his heaviest thoughts concern these things most light. He saw the mystery in each leaf unfurled, and sought the secret harmony of the world. He felt the key in mathematics lay, as had Pythagoras in ancient days. And like old Plato, he pursued the truth through perfect forms envisioned in his youth. We'll play our play today upon 3 stages to represent Johannes' various ages. This grove of trees is sheltered years of youth, within which stand his perfect forms of truth. A pit to represent his middle years, beset by wars and plagues and worldly fears. And finally, the old philosopher's mound, we might say globe, on which our man can stop and look around and peer beyond this world's distracting bars, and if the weather's willing, see the stars. So, welcome now to our alfresco stage, and meet J. Kepler, wonder of his age.
Our story starts as Kepler's birth we see in Wilderstadt in southwest Germany. He was the grandson of the balding mayor, whose scruples were more scanty than his hair. His dad, a mercenary, no man's friend, vicious and quarrelsome, doomed to no good end. His mom and grandma, both named Katherina, fought endlessly. Perhaps mom was the meaner. She also took to brewing herbal potions that served, some claimed, for devilish devotions. So like her aunt, who no apology'd make, she nearly ended her life at the stake. Into this family, brutish, base, and wild, was born Johann, a thin and sickly child. His early memories of the world were sad. Discordant family life nearly drove him mad. He seemed consumed by fevers, boils, and sores, deprived of father, always off to wars. And yet, 2 childhood memories show a spark that, like starlight pierce the stormy dark. One, at age 6, in 1577, when with his mother he surveyed the heavens, from a high hill to see a comet's flame. The other, 3 years later, came outside with his dad to see the moon's eclipse. His hopes hung on these fragmentary slips. At school, he fought with friends who taunt and tease, turning the former into enemies. He hated baths like a dog gnawing on a bone. Said, "I am a mangy dog, all alone." And though the years some graces to him taught, he never flinched from saying what he thought. At Tübingen, he learned astronomy from Michael Maślanka, thence theology. He studied there for 7 years at least, hoping to become a Lutheran priest. But his faith in Copernicus, and worse, loud claims of a sun-centered universe, filled theologians at his school with dread. So they found him a different post instead. Soon Kepler was installed in far-off Graz, a teacher of astronomy and math. Now all astronomers of Kepler's day, relying on kings for patronage and pay, were under obligation to produce horoscopes and predictions for their use, in planning lucky battles and campaigns. So Kepler too was asked to set his brains to calendar making. What a dirty puddle, he said, of venturing into astrology's muddle. And yet, his calendars, which he did rue, oddly enough, seemed often to be true. He accurately told of raids by Turks and freezing winters when no man could work. His fame grew for what he considered trash, and calendars often brought in needed cash. Beneath it all, he secretly believed that when God had the universe conceived, the stars and all below were intertwined, and so although it was most unrefined, astrology and astronomy, its mate, held secret news about human fate. This post, as a teacher at a school for boys, turned out to be a most unfortunate choice. My Lutheran church fathers, Kepler's thought, flew off on such wild tangents, like as not, he'd leave his poor young charges far behind, pursuing the flighty brilliance of his mind. And often he'd emerge from discourse deep to find his students gone or fast asleep. Their fathers, Lumpenburgers, he thought crass when they removed the children from his class. Nevertheless, the school still stood his pay and recognized a brilliant mind at play. Though he'd no students, this was not defeat, for mathematics is not all men's meat. And yet he must teach rhetoric and Latin until attendance in his maths class batten. It wasn't such a mathematics class with students longing for the hour to pass, and Kepler at the blackboard with his chalk, confusing all the boys with rambling talk, that suddenly the heavens did reveal their secret truth, it seemed, and set the seal on all of Kepler's subsequent belief. It happened as he drew in bold relief an equilateral triangle, one bound by circles, one within and one around. It struck him then that their proportions were as Saturn's orbit is to Jupiter. This revelation struck him with such power, he let his pupils go before the hour, and rushing to his rooms, he drew upon a sheet of paper nests of polygons, inscribed in circles. Sure enough, it seemed to give results that he had only dreamed. Describing the orbital distance from the sun of all 6 planets, once he had begun, his mind raced outwards. Was it not the case that planets whirl in 3-dimensional space? 6 planets known to man, and in between 5 intervals whose distance could be seen. But why did God make 5, and why such gaps? There were 5 perfect forms, perhaps. Interpolated amongst the orbit spheres, they could explain the question of the years. So Kepler, feverish yet with delight, took his calculations long into the night, sure that his muse, his strength of intuition, would lead him surely to his life's ambition, to hear more clearly heaven's harmony and understand the cosmic mystery. So at age 25, he wrote his first book, Mysterium Cosmographicum, his first look, and setting forth a new cosmology and undermining poor old Ptolemy. He saw his model as truth revealed, yet he did not think his spheres and solids real, and tangible but mathematical guides to forces sun and planets held inside, which in the cosmos played upon each other like magnetism recently discovered. He was the first astronomer to say that planets moved because of forces play, and yet he still included as a key to understanding cosmic mystery what we deem pseudoscience and quackery, astrology and numerology. He was indeed a bridge across the ages, connecting Greek, medieval, and modern sages. Now, around this time it had come to pass that Kepler's worthy friends who lived in Graz felt it unwise that such a likely pup should stay unmarried. So, they set him up. With a young widow, heiress to some land, young Barbara Mueller offered him her hand. They were wed. The stars were not propitious, and Kepler feared his friends were too ambitious on his behalf for standing for wealth. But still, this is a wedding. Toast the health and beauty of the bridegroom and the bride. When they parade by you, please step aside. We're coming now to the ending of Act 1. When we reach the next stage, 2 has begun. Welcome, dear listeners, to the Kepler's place, where Jobst, Frau Barbara's father, felt disgrace at his poor son-in-law's low-class extraction. This was no case of mutual attraction. Kepler found Mueller vain and crass and proud, and Mueller thought Kepler poor and said it loud. My girl deserves a better man than this. And Barbara, too, felt something was amiss. Her previous 2 husbands, older gents, had guaranteed her comfort, paid the rent, and died rich. But this Kepler, let's confess, depended on his dad-in-law's largesse. Lived in his house, consumed his wine, and even begrudged his new-wed wife his time. To escort her into society, consumed as he was by his astronomy. The devilish pursuit that filled his days confused poor Barbara in mazy ways. It seemed to her husband shut her out. She had no clue what his work was about, and he'd no interest in her burger's dreams. They could not talk of anything, it seems. So quarrels or cruel silence filled the air. They were the epitome of mismatched pair. Aside from angry words, a tragedy of huge proportion wrecked the harmony that might have come. Their first 2 babies dear were lost to fever in their infant year. It was a calamity beyond belief. We'll leave them now to struggle with their grief. Now, Kepler was a Lutheran, perhaps, one of 1,000 living close to Graz. The Archduke Ferdinand, who ruled the region, was faithful to the Roman-based religion and vowed to give Austrian Lutherans the heave. So Kepler was told, renounce your faith or leave. Never equipped with smooth word to placate an angry king, Kepler accepted fate and took his exile, first a month or so, but then he saw he'd really have to go. With torture and death for heretics at hand, he settled in some unknown foreign land. Where could a mathematician find a post pursuing the problems that concerned him most? Expressing beliefs and theories without worry, with access to a good observatory? The single answer to these questions lay in the odd personage of Tycho Brahe. Tycho, the great observer of the skies, a Danish aristocrat. He had his prized observatory on the Isle of Hveen near Copenhagen, from which point he'd seen and measured the planet's retrogrades and veers with great precision over 20 years. Tycho, like Kepler, had been forced to flee by a young king who shunned his tyranny over the people of his island home. So Tycho left Uraniborg to roam through Central Europe with his retinue of courtiers, assistants, dwarves, a motley crew who drank and caused a ruckus and cavorted, his astronomical instruments too transported within the coaches of his caravan. For Tycho had a clear and simple plan to find an accepting monarch and nation who'd finance his great celestial observation. At Prague, the Brahe had finally settled down at Benedict Castle, just outside of town, while Emperor Rudolph renovated this palace to suit his Mathematicus Imperialis. He built a new Uraniborg with all his instruments and helpers well installed. It was to this bohemian sanctuary that Tycho invited Kepler, refugee, to come and work and earn a salary in the process change astronomy. They met on New Year's Day in 1600. But neither knew that Tycho's days were numbered. With just 18 more months more on this whirling earth, within that time, they gave new worlds their birth. At Benedict, young Kepler was assigned the problem of Mars' orbit. His keen mind was pulled and wrenched to solve its mystery. For 7 years, he fought for mastery over the planet's vagaries at last, throwing all caution to the winds he cast, away the work of several thousand years, and did away with planetary spheres. Also, the doctrine of uniform motion in planetary orbits with this notion. He felt he was floundering in a sea of geometric possibility. Forsaking circles, all was a morass of lumpin, bumpy oval shapes at last. A number that came that echoed in his mind, 0.0429, that reoccurred in ratios from equations describing Mars' orbit and angle of observation. At last, the reward for many years of pain, and Kepler knew his work was not in vain. This was no oval shape, but an ellipse. And as the sun emerges from eclipse, Kepler emerged with his immortal laws, expounding planets' motions and their cause. The second, the planet's orbit's radial lines sweep out equal areas in equal times. The first, found second, I don't know what the joke is. They move with the sun in the ellipse at one focus. I hope you'll excuse this dreadful rhyme. Focus was harder to fit in with time. So Kepler had loosed the genie from the bottle and freed astronomy from Aristotle. And his conceit of motion uniform and Plato's view of heaven's perfect form, diverse from the earthly sphere of death and birth, was Kepler the priest who married heaven and earth. For all this work, he owed great veneration to Tycho Brahe's accurate observations, a store of fact, cold and uncompromising, that must be accounted for in theorizing. So, belasted with fact, young Kepler might not be so flighty when his mind took flight, and armed with observations cry defiance. It was the genesis of modern science. And all this came to pass when Tycho died. And Kepler, at his deathbed, frankly lied and stole his observation charts for Mars so we could understand the course of stars. So, Tycho died, and Kepler came to be a hero with his new astronomy. He stayed for many years in Prague, the Emperor Rudolph's mathematical dog, compelled to jump and bark at his bequests. Although the Emperor's court was in a mess, and Rudolph's wits were as muddled as his reign, so Kepler and his family suffered pain. And though they were in court, grave poverty as Rudolph never paid his salary. All this as well as constant consternation regarding details of his publication. 1611, Prague was torn by war, and academics worse now than before. The loyal Kepler swore he would survive in hellish Prague while Rudolph was alive. In 1612, the emperor lost his life, and poor Johannes' little boy and wife fell to attacks of fever that same year. Kepler had lost all that he held most dear. In terrible disaster, now he left for Linz in Austria, where now bereft. Of emperor's court and patronage patrician, he took the low post, provincial mathematician. Soon after this demotion had occurred, Kepler was summoned back to Württemberg to act as witness at his mother's trial for sorcery and witchcraft, at which her denial was weakened by a tendency to vex and her reputation as a local hex. The locals said that Catherine's herbal spells had sickened folk and killed a few as well. They cast on her the burden of her blame for all their fevers, illnesses, and pains. The devil opened doors on her behalf, they said, and she had killed a farmer's calf. Poor Kepler was victim of their sport. Was he not an astrologer at court? They called him master of the blackest art, and yet he took his sorry mother's part and organized her upkeep and defense without the slightest hope of recompense. For 6 long years, accusers sang their song. The trial was ghastly, squalid, and so long that when his sordid mother was absolved, they scarce believed the problem was solved. His mom died 6 months later on a Sunday. 'Twas in this time he wrote Harmonia Mundi. How Kepler found the heart when so admired, the troubles of the world and sick and tired, to write his work on cosmic harmony remains an everlasting mystery. His harmony seeks, for better or worse, to show the secrets of the universe in music and the stars, astrology, religion, astronomy, geometry. He finds in all existence God's first plan and sets the heavens singing in his hands. And in this lush, luxuriant thought concealed, his planetary third law is revealed. Now, in his last years, Kepler took no rest. He wed a second time. This time, he was blessed with children and domestic harmony, and so turned all his newfound energy to publications, studies, work, and friends. And yet we find Johannes, near the end of his productive life, inclined to bring himself to woe through curious wanderings. At first, it was the tables, Rudolphine, complete now after some 2 decades' time. Those tables of precise calculations, mapping the planets' motions through their stations. He went to Vienna to collect the fee the emperor owed him for his salary. But Rudolph's successor sent him from town to town, on horse and on foot, to chase money down. A year was thus spent in travel, strain, and strife, a year of discomfort far from home and wife. Then for 4 years he risked all he was able to put into print those same Rudolphine tables. His task was complicated even more by the chaotic 30-year-long war. When he finally found a printer's shop in Linz that would print it, Soldiers put a stop to all by setting up their bunks and mess right in the shop beside the printer's press. At last, despite all odds, the work was done, and Kepler's final wanderings had begun. We see, dear friends, poor Kepler at his last, pursuing the life his dad had in the past, forsaking all the joys and warmth of home, and setting out upon the road to Rome. Most aimlessly and fruitlessly, it seems, his fertile, restless mind was working still. So, follow me, dear listeners, to the hill, where we can speak of Kepler's final works and play the play of his last days on Earth. The siege of Linz. The Keplers had to find a new home, leaving that small town behind, to Regensburg, and thence to Ulm, and then Tübingen, Frankfurt, back to Ulm again, and then to Prague to suit the emperor's whim, and dedicate those tables writ for him. When Kepler crossed the Danube's waves this time, he found a friend in General Wallenstein, a patron of whom astrology did enchant, and Wallenstein's horoscope is still extant. Then Regensburg, Linz, then Prague again, Sagan. But Kepler never was a wealthy man. The harsh travail of travel in the cold and wet had made him prematurely old. Another trip to Regensburg, alas, the end to wanderings had come to pass. On an old nag to Regensburg he came, a fever burning in his eyes, whose flame, increasing evermore, sent him to bed, where mute he'd point, his hand now at his head, now at the sky above him, as to say, his mind would grasp the heavens far away, and quench his fever with the rising sun, and maybe he thought of all the work he'd done, his 3 laws and his new astronomy, though optics he gave to geometry, the principle of continuity, and postulated a point at infinity, the basis of projective geometry. So Kepler, far from friends in a strange town, wearied by illness, laid his body down and gave up the ghost. We hope he's reached the stars. His grave was long destroyed by wars, though we still have his epitaph, this treasure. I measured once the skies, now shadows measure. Skybound the mind, earthbound the body rests. Peace to you, Johannes, in your quest.
Dance us out.